Hey there, friends and enemies, JoPaWrites here again, and today I want to do one final archetype tier list in Remnant 2 now that we've got the last DLC, the Dark Horizon, in hand, and the dust is settled for the most recent patch. Now, keep in mind a few things. Some of this is going to be playstyle preference, but also how well some of these archetypes perform, not only by themselves, but also in conjunction with other builds, and in the hardest difficulty in the game, meaning the Apocalypse, Gauntlet, Boss Rush mode, stuff like that. So, with all that being said, if you disagree, if you have different rankings, let me know in the comments down below. Just try to be respectful. This is all for fun and not to be taken too seriously. But anyway, let's just jump right into it with the most recent archetype, the Warden. This one is a bit underwhelming in my opinion, and I'll explain why. Now, I was pretty excited about this. I've made builds with pretty much every other archetype for the Warden, and it just feels lackluster in comparison to other support or healing options like the Medic or something of that nature. And for that reason, I'm going to knock it down just a bit. Now, in comparison with the other two recent archetypes that we've gotten with the other DLC, the Invoker and the Ritualist just feel significantly better. And because of that, I have to bump it down a little bit. I do enjoy this subclass. What I don't like is the fact that it doesn't feel like you can often see the effects that you're having with this one, because it is a bit more defensive, focusing on shield. I think the combat turret is a bit, or the combat drone is a little bit underwhelming. And so while it does help, it's not going to be nearly as powerful as something like a turret, for example. So because of that, it does drop down a little bit. I don't think it's bad. You can beat pretty much any content in the game with basically any archetype, but it's just not good enough to really be a great example for the last archetype we're getting in the game. There's just other options that are better right now, and for that reason, it's just knocked down a little bit. And that's frustrating considering it is the last DLC, but that being said, I do feel like it has its place. I understand what they were going for, and maybe if they buff some of the interactions with shields and this archetype, it could improve even more, and you can make a Juggernaut that also does a lot of damage. But instead, you're pretty much relying on other archetypes to carry the load, and yeah, it just doesn't feel as good as I would want it to feel. So moving on, we have something that's very different in the Invoker, and I think this is S tier. It's one of the great secondary classes, and what I mean by that is it can pretty much enhance any other archetype in the game, and so you can run this in almost any other pairing. It's pretty insane, especially now that they've reverted the change to the Way of Keula, so it can damage enemies through walls, essentially. And so because of that, I think it is phenomenal. Now, another really good thing about the Invoker is the perks are phenomenal, and I just think it does a lot of things really, really well, especially because you can run so many different builds, not only with other archetypes, but you can run a weapon damage build, you can run a skill damage build, you can run a mod damage build. The versatility is insane, and if you're doing anything like the farming, the boss rush mode, you can absolutely just nuke entire levels with the Way of Keula or even the other skills that it does have. So I do feel like this is one of the best options in the game currently. Maybe not the best, but I think it's phenomenal overall. The only thing that knocks it just a little bit is the nerf to Archon, and that build with the Way of Keula and the Tickle Fingers, that thing was absolutely insane. So it's not quite as good as it might once have been, but I do think it's still very, very good. Now we have the Challenger. I think this is solidly in the A tier. Now, Challenger is great because it is perfect for any melee build, and for a long time, melee builds were not super viable, but now we have so many different options. We have ranged damage weapons, we have up-close damage weapons, and so because of that, I do feel like this is a archetype that has really benefited not only from getting buffs itself, but also new items, new weapons, new mods around it that have really seen the rise of the Challenger. Plus, the way Bulwark works now and how strong and effective it is and how pretty much vital it is for a lot of tank builds, I think that boosts the Challenger even more, and so that's why I think it is solidly in the A tier. Now, some people might argue up or down a slot. I can see it with it. I don't think it's S personally, just because I think there's others that just do a better job overall, and also I do feel like it can't be lower because it's just superior to everything that I have in the B tier. So I think the solidly in the A tier is where the Challenger belongs, and I just wish it was more versatile in some of its skills, like what you want to choose. But that seems to be the case for pretty much all classes these days, is there's not a whole lot of options when it comes to picking the best skills for that class. Next up, we have the Handler. And this kind of pains me because I think the Handler is still pretty solid. I like it quite a bit. It was my first archetype that I ever played in the game, and having the Best Boy is still one of my favorite things, but I think it's a B tier. I just don't think it's good enough by itself to carry anything. And so it does do a lot to support. It does have a lot of variety when it comes to your builds as well, but it just is not the type of build that is as useful as it once was, as we've gotten additional items in the game. And it's almost got the reverse problem of the Challenger, where the Challenger improved because we got a lot of things that improved upon its specific skill set. Whereas the Handler, I don't feel like that's the case in a lot of situations. It felt like this Handler was the best in the early game when you had a lot of bleed focus and a lot of different options to combine it with, and you didn't have other archetypes that could overlap what the Handler does. And that's why I'm going to knock it down just a bit. Next up, we have the Hunter. This is going to be my second S tier. I think Hugs is still great. If you're a crit build player, it's still phenomenal for damage. Yes, you're very squishy with it, but I think you can actually combine the Hunter with a lot of tankier options and create builds that have sustainability, survivability, and also do a ton of damage. So while it's never going to do the max damage that you can get with Hugs, I still feel like the Hunter is the better option of the two if you're going to separate them. And that's why I'm putting Hunter at S tier and Gunslinger at the A tier. I still think Gunslinger is very good as well. It does a lot of damage, and there are a lot of reasons. If you're a weapon-focused player, it does a lot, and it can be very, very valuable. However, like I mentioned, one of the major problems when you're on Apocalypse difficulty, if you don't have the right build setup, is that, or if you're not an extremely skilled player, is that the squishiness can cost you, especially when you're on these long 50-minute runs, and one mistake of a bad timing of a dodge and then you're dead. So that's where I think Hugs is phenomenal, especially when you're just tackling one boss at a time, but it just loses that little bit of edge when you are faced with not only waves of enemies, but then heading into the boss fights and then doing that over and over and over again and not having the tankiness that I think is very important for those longer runs. Then we have the Medic. I think the Medic is also an A tier. Now, I think this is one of the best support options. It's great healing. It's got great damage resist if you built it that way. It's a great secondary class. It's perfect if you are running a gauntlet or even the 7-wave boss rush mode and you're playing with friends who don't have optimized builds or are playing Hugs and need that extra bit of survivability. You can run this as a full support class, or you can run it as a secondary with the Hunter or something of that nature that does a lot of damage and have that survivability mixed in with the ability to stay alive. And I think that's very, very valuable, especially with the new current endgame. I think pretty much every build you can make these days can melt individual bosses, so I don't think even on Apocalypse difficulty that's really a problem, but surviving wave after wave, not making mistakes, dealing with the challenges getting harder over time, I think is important, and that's why I think the Medic is very valuable. The Alchemist, I think a lot of people like the Alchemist, so we'll put it A tier. I'm going to throw it in B tier, and I say this because while a lot of the concoctions you can get are very good, And I do think it benefits from having those additional options up all the time. There's a lot of versatility in that, so you can kind of customize your build. I just feel like because it's more of a jack of all trades, it doesn't do what some of these other specialized archetypes do as well. And because of that, that's why I knock it just a little bit. I do think it's still pretty solid overall. Like I said, you can run basically any archetype and beat any content in this game right now. But as far as what I see and what people are running and everything, just judging by the reaction to it, it doesn't feel like a lot of people are throwing on the Alchemist at this point. And that's a bummer because I do feel like it's still a pretty solid option. It's just not as flashy or shiny as others that we do have currently in the game. Speaking of, now we have the Archon. And this recently got a nerf. So it was S tier for sure. I think it's A tier now. Some people will say it's still S tier. Other people say it's trash and it might be C tier. I find that it's still very, very good. And the reason for that is whereas before, while the lightning hands was the only viable option, now it's doing what the class was always intended to do and leading into that mod damage and mod duration, all that kind of stuff. So you're really focusing more on mods now with some of the other skills rather than just using the lightning all the time. It was kind of obnoxious that you could essentially just use your monolith, use your nebula, cast your Way of Keola, and then go into your lightning mode for infinity and do absurd damage. So I do feel like that was broken, and I understand why they've changed it. And I feel like now the archetype is in a good spot. It just feels bad because this is the hardest to get archetype in the game. So people are obviously going to be a little bit frustrated when it does get nerfed because it should be special. It should feel really good. And I think it is. I think people just don't want to change up the way they look at their builds with this. And so that's why they're annoyed. But I think it's still very, very good. Then we have the Engineer. This one is interesting because I think it's limited in the type of builds you can make with it, but I think it's phenomenal for what it does. I've made some pretty insane builds personally. 100% tanky. I think it's A tier. Not everyone's going to like it. I think this is the type of archetype which is going to be one of the more divisive options in the game. And I say that because if you don't want to use your turret, if you don't want to set it down and let it aid you, or if you don't want to hold it the whole time, this archetype is not going to be for you. But if you lean into the turret, I've had invincibility turret builds where I'm using the Explorer of all archetypes just to stay alive permanently. I have used the Warden archetype to really the Challenger. No matter what archetype you're running, as long as you are essentially keeping yourself alive, this one does really, really good damage, and you can combine it with a lot of different options. And so that's why I think it's phenomenal. I am a big fan of the Engineer personally, and it's one of those archetypes that has absolutely grown on me over the course of time, even though, again, I know I might be in the minority. Explorer, C tier. This one is probably the worst archetype in the game, and it's a bummer. I wish they would have done something to buff this or make it useful. I know there are ways to make it potentially be okay, but overall it's just used for new players who want to find all the secrets and don't want to look them up. That's essentially what the Explorer does, and the only reason to run it at this current point. There is just no benefit in most builds because other archetypes do everything that it does just simply better, and that's unfortunate for me as somebody who wants to like it but just does not really enjoy it nearly as much as I thought I would. Now we have the Invader. The Invader is interesting to me because I think it's a B tier, and so the reason I say that is because you can make some unbelievable builds with this, but it's so hyper specific in how you have to build it that it just lacks that versatility, and also you have to play a very particular style in order to enjoy using this one, and that knocks it down for me as well. I just want to have some different options when I'm playing the game, and if I'm going through and I'm doing the same thing over and over and over again, that's where I get a bit bored, and it does feel like the Invader has a lack of options that can be very, very frustrating. Overall, I think it's good. I think it's still very good. I think there are some fun builds to make with it. I I wanted to do some builds that, some ninja-based builds that felt insanely fun, but they're just not useful against the majority of bosses in the game. They're also not as effective as I would hope, and so because of that, it's going to drop it down. Now, I know, like I said, I know there are some crack builds. You can find a insane build for almost every single archetype in this game in combination with another one. But when I'm looking at it, what archetypes are getting the most builds made with them, which ones are getting the most clears of the high-end content, and which ones are doing so with ease regardless of skill level necessarily. So I think that's why I think archetype, the invader class drops down just a bit. Now, summoner, I'm going to put in B. I like the summoner as well. Again, I used to be a summoner main. I used to run summoner handler. I used to run summoner engineer. Like, a lot of these different builds I thought were fantastic. And unfortunately, I think they're just overshadowed by some easier options. Once again, as we've gotten new items into the game, some of our old favorites have fallen behind and lost a bit of their excitement, lost a bit of their luster, with whether it's going to be some of the amulets or rings or weapons and mods. All of that changes the way you play. So in the future, with a game like this, I hope developers keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to buff underperforming things if you give it more interactions with things that work really, really well. Same thing with old favorites. If they start to fall behind, make new items that enhance what that does. You can buff things. You can buff the archetype itself. You can buff some of the items that it goes along with. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the best thing to do is to add new options, new ways to play, and new fun to have. So then we finally have the Ritualist archetype. This is one of my favorites. I want to put this in S tier, but I think it's A tier. I think it's very, very good. Very versatile, lots of great options to run this with. By far the best damage over time builds, the best builds that do damage with different status effects. I think all of that is very fun for me. And so for me, this would be the highest A tier for me personally, just because it's my favorite archetype in the game currently. That being said, I understand its limitations and also why people might not have it as high as I do. You definitely need some additional help in order to make this shine when it comes to certain weapons and mods and all that kind of good stuff. So I do like it. I do think it's very, very good. I still think that for me personally, my favorite combination in the game right now is Invoker and Ritualist. I think that's the best way to go, especially having the Invoker as my prime and multiple skills for each class. You can just essentially spam them. It's pretty insane, and I just really enjoy that combination. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel as always. If you disagree, like I said, don't argue with anybody and be super aggressive. Just like, let's talk it out. Maybe you can sway some opinions. I've had it in the past where I've rated something and then someone's come in and kind of shown me the light and showed that I was not necessarily as spot on as I might have thought. So let me know in the comments down below. My name is JoPa. Have a good one. I'll catch you all later.